Good afternoon. This is the Board of County Commissioners Board Work Session. It is Wednesday, November 29th, 2023. It is 1:03 p.m. This session is set to go until 2:30 p.m. This is a hybrid meeting. We're at 3000 Pacific Avenue Southeast, room 110 for public virtual attendance. You may follow along on the Thurston County YouTube channel. I'm Carolina Mejia. I'm the chair of the board. Vice Chair Ty Minster, as well as Commissioner Gary Edwards, Commissioner Emily Klaus, Commissioner Wayne Bernier are in attendance. Commissioner Gary Edwards will be excused a little bit later on in the meeting. And we're here to, this is a follow-up to the A-25 Forest Land Conversion Code update. Dana is here to present this, as well as Ashley, and who's doing the intro? Ashley? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Commissioners, and good afternoon. Ashley Rye, Community Planning Manager. This is a follow-up briefing. However, we will recap some of that background information that we covered a few weeks back, since we didn't have a lot of time. And we have new commissioners that are here. And then we will walk through sort of what the, well, I'll let Dana cover what we're walking through, but we'll sort of recap and then take next steps. And leave as much time for discussion and questions as possible. So I'll turn it over to Dana to do the presentation.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Dana Bowers, Associate Planner for Community Planning and Economic Development. We're talking about the healthy forest and especially the forest conversion code updates today. Thanks for attending and giving us your ear so we can learn a little bit more about it. So, oh yes, I need to share my presentation. Thank you. So, as it was said, this is a follow-up, but the first one was very brief, so we'll go into a little bit more detail. What we're really talking today is we're going to do an overview of the background and then the public comments that kind of led to the decisions, and then really get into what are the changes of the code. And then those changes really help clarify the activities, the forest cutting activities, and making sure that the standards are clear for permitting staff and that we are still incentivizing protecting larger trees for future use and for all the ecological benefits they provide. So
I'll go ahead and advance for you.
Okay.
You don't have to worry about it. Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Ashley. So when we, next slide. So just to help you understand where this comes from, it was a board initiated priority, and so it was docketed initially in 2009. So that was quite some time ago to be on the initial docket, and then it got moved up to the official docket in 2020. And we came to the board and asked for appropriate scope of the work entailed, because it is a really complex issue and it involves a lot of the different pieces of code. So bringing that project to you, getting a scope from the board at the time, getting a scope from them about how to move forward, really framed and put boundaries on this project. So what pieces are we going to handle now? What pieces are we going to handle later? So if you hear me say things like that's out of scope, that was decided by the board at the time, and we can handle other project pieces outside of that. So moving on from then, in 2022, we moved into a planning commission. The first thing we did was ask them to take a look at the concepts and like the general idea and the framework for these changes and say, is this something you can support? And we had unanimous support in that area. And that's a very diverse community body that kind of looks at planning decisions. So they were able to move forward with these main ideas. And the ones that really rung out were just reducing the complexity as much as possible. Like I said, this is like intertwined with a few different of our code pieces all throughout the development code. And so how to make it more easy to understand and easy to administer for our permit staff, and then easy to follow for our residents.
For new commissioners, can you
Sure.
explain what the permits are that this section of code?
Yes, absolutely. So the permits in this section of code really pertain to only one forestry permit, and we have a slide at the back. One more. Yeah. Yeah, so we just wanted to make sure we had something for you to look at, because this is the complexity, this is the tricky stuff. State code or state law really regulates the Forest Practices Act, which is most of what happens with forestry, even as much as how much people can cut without a permit, even on their own property, and how much, when they need to start getting, or when permits start happening for people on their property. So those permits are the class 1, those forest practices are class 1, class 2, class 3, and class 4 special, kind of listed above. Class 1 don't need a permit under state law. We don't have any,
I'm so sorry.
that's all right. So the class 1 permits, or the class 1 forest practices, no permits. Class 2, 3, class 4 special, permits under state law. And the only piece we have jurisdiction over is the class 4 permits. And those are ones where forest land is being converted to any other use. So if someone wants to put in a single family home, they're converting from forest, and they have forest land, they're converting from forest to another use, and they need to have a class 4 permit.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
So when you say any other use using a home, I think that's different than comes out of from a tax issue. It's undoubtedly been in a protected issue, and you have to pay 7 years back taxes at the current rate, I think.
It's only if it's been classified as forestry.
Yes.
And not all land has been classified as forestry use.
Yeah, and
So
that would
are
be
you saying if you have a 10-acre parcel of land,
Mhm.
it's not classified in that forestry reduction,
Right.
then you have to do something different besides just getting a building permit?
So the tax piece is completely separate. So this is really just the permits associated with cutting those trees. So you have commercial forestry permits, which are regulated by the state, and the assumption there is that it's in commercial forestry, it will remain in commercial forestry. The only permits that we have jurisdiction over at the county are when you're taking it out of forestry, but it's taking it out of forestry from the state's
Forest
commercial
use.
forestry perspective, not taxes.
I don't know of any properties in Thurston County that are forest properties that are not in the forest tax. So I think those two things are gonna get intertangled somehow in some kind of legalities if we don't address it.
It would be documented, it's just that the code that you're looking at here, the proposed code, doesn't touch what the assessor's office does in terms of their open space program.
But maybe it should, or recognize it.
In terms of noticing for applications and stuff.
Well,
We can follow up and see whether that's
I've done
already-
this myself where I've had property, transferred it so you could log it or do something different to it. So I know how it works, and I don't think what you're proposing so far is gonna help that. That's what I'm concerned about.
Okay.
Can I ask about the permits? So is class 1 and class 4, like, if I'm gonna convert it from forest land to a house, but I'm under 5,000 board feet, I don't know how many, if that's even possible, because I don't know how many board feet are in a tree, but does that mean I don't need a class 4 permit because I'm not, like, if I'm under 5,000 board feet, doesn't matter if I'm converting or what I'm doing, I'm selling, I'm foresting, I can just do it, paying $150 to DNR, right?
That is DNR's standard at the state level, and it is actually somewhat protected. So yeah, anything under 5,000 board feet. And there is a 2-acre parcel limit as well. And so however that plays into your build site, if you have a 1/4-acre lot, this may not pertain to you.
So it's bigger conversions that need a class 4 general permit.
And a follow-up to that, how about the danger trees? And the code on danger trees?
Right, so that's still part of the code, and danger trees that actually exist in, I think it's critical areas. And so that wasn't part of this update. We left the definition alone because it exists there and it has a purpose. And so we just made sure that all of our exemptions align with state exemptions and the hazard tree, danger tree piece is in there.
The danger tree portion of it is gonna conflict with some of this. I can see it coming, because the length of the tree, where it can reach, there's a lot of
Right.
stuff yet to be answered, I guess. I'll just let it go at that for now.
Is it okay to continue? Are there any?
Yeah.
So that's the permits, and really just to recap, the only one that we have authority to manipulate is a class 4, and that's only because we took it. Most of the counties in this state don't manage their own class 4 or don't administer their own class 4 permits. They allow the state to administer the class 4 permits. So I think we're 1 in 5, maybe less than that. So it is pretty rare. Back up, so when we're really thinking about what that means in terms of our authority and what we're doing, we wanted to make sure that the planning commission was on board. Like I said, we had a unanimous decision there. And then we took the information and talked to the folks that it would impact. We talked to the, let me get my list up so I don't miss anybody, but Washington Contract Loggers Association. We talked to Olympia Master Builders. We talked to the Thurston Climate Action Team and local tree groups and a broad reach of the different impacted stakeholders, recognizing that this is not a commercial forestry issue. This is more of a developer issue, where when developers are trying to, clear a piece of land to put more development there or sell a piece of land, this kind of thing, that's really where this permit kind of lives. When it comes to commercial forest things, that really lives with the state, just really trying to make that distinction. So talking to those groups, they really wanted to prioritize protections for larger trees, make sure that we had those incentivized, that we were providing flexibility in site design, and that kind of gets to your point, Commissioner Edwards. That if we can provide some flexibility with how people are designing their site, and they can preserve trees in one area and have more protection for their home in another area. And we really tried to work with that because of this feedback. And so you'll see that hopefully in the, as it follows. But, and also to simplify the permit process, having to get a building permit and a forest timber permit and a potentially critical areas permit in some cases, or, the layers of permits can get a little bit difficult. So we wanted to make sure that we were creating avenues for people to, like, this is your lane, this is your lane, and this is your lane. And not say, but you could do this or this or this, and make it more complex than it needed to be. So, the Planning Commission, there we go. The Planning Commission held 3 work sessions, and they had a public hearing, and based on the feedback, we made some minor changes and updates, and were able to address the tree classifications. So how are we calling what trees? What is a larger tree? And really pinning down what that means and using numbers so that we can quantify it and it's not subjective, right? 2, we wanted to coordinate with state permits and make sure that those had like hand in glove coordination moving forward through that dialogue between the state and how they issue permits and how we respond to those permits and how we issue permits and what that means for state level action.
And just to clarify, so the Planning Commission approved these concepts, these initial concepts.
Right.
Then we did outreach, and outreach really helped shape what the
Right.
proposal was that went back to the Planning Commission for
Yes.
their follow-up briefings. Through those briefings and the public hearing, we heard this additional feedback from the community, constructive feedback, and the changes that Deanna is talking about with the tree classifications and this clarity on what the state's role is and what the county's role is, was in response to that Planning Commission feedback and comments during the public hearing. So there's kind of multiple phases of feedback that shaped what you have before you.
Right.
Madam Chair, we love to. So what did you end up with on a definition on larger trees?
It is in the slide. Do you mind if I get to it, or do you
Oh,
want to?
yeah, I know, I'm just trying
Is
to,
that okay? Yeah.
excited about it too.
Great. And then, so Planning Commission did recommend these changes, 5 a vote of 5-2, and to approve the package. They also had some recommendations, or they also had a recommendation about enforcement and how to use our fees and fine structure within forestry, but that's outside of the scope. And so that's something that needs to be handled through a different project.
I have a question in regards to the 5-2 vote and kind of what those conversations entailed and how they kind of landed there.
Sure. So I think one of the best pieces of this is that we came to the board, to the planning commission early and got the framework settled. And so for the most part, everything was on the same page. The really, I guess, the sticking point for the commissioners that voted no was that they felt the code didn't quite go far enough. I think I have a quote from one of our commissioners that said, I'm sorry, it's in a later slide, I think, but basically that while he saluted our efforts, or while the commissioners saluted our efforts, they felt more clarification about the percentage retained would be valuable, because the percentage retained was something he felt, or they felt, that we could improve upon and retain a greater percentage of those significant and I think we call them heritage trees. So the different tree classes, and you can see that in the code.
If I could just suggest, because I sat down with you guys for
Sure.
an hour or something. We don't even know what the changes are yet, so it's
Yeah.
hard for,
Yes.
you're telling us about the
Yeah.
outreach that was done, what the planning commission thought. Like, I think we need to get to the
Changes.
changes, and then we can ask the corollary questions.
So let them give their presentation.
Exactly.
Okay, so proposed changes, really reflecting those concepts. The first one was really just we had 2 sets of code in the county for this one thing, and to bring those together and make sure we just had one set of code going forward. We had something for inside the North County UGAs and then everything else. And so having 2 pathways was like, well, which one do I belong in? It was more complicated. So that was one of the things that we're changing. It also allows the cities, making that pathway allows the cities to work within their UGAs and the joint code process to have their city codes, or their municipality codes, trickle out through the UGAs through a joint agreement with us, right? And that's how those UGAs are supposed to work.
So the joint code updates would be future.
Oh,
So-
that's
so-
totally
So this is really
future.
just forest conversion, making sure it's.
Making sure it's clear.
Yes, in the same, and that was
Concise.
actually one of the pieces of feedback from the planning commission when they dug into this. They really felt that the standards that were already established for inside the UGA, and the way that had been working, it would be beneficial to extend those outside the UGA.
Right. So requiring concurrent development applications was the second big change. So right now, you can get a class 4 forest permit, which is that forest conversion permit, but you don't necessarily have to have your development planned now. You can clear the site, and then there's no limit to how many years you have to plan your site or plan your development and do the development. So that's been a bit of a tricky thing, because as soon as you clear a site, then we have a lot of different impacts, like invasive species and flooding potential, and the water flow from flood situations. And it just, having those 2 things come together, so we have the forest conversions and the development permit coming at the same time, really helps people to think, where do I need to do my development and what trees do I need to remove to do that? Rather than just kind of speculative clearing, well, maybe I might put my development over here, or maybe I might do this, but maybe I'll just clear the whole site in case we need the whole space for everything. That's kind of speculative, and it doesn't really lead to incentivizing or like prioritizing keeping larger trees. It's kind of a wholesale method, which has led to, in some cases, we see some parcels just getting cleared and then sold on the real estate market because it's a cleared site, and it can be more valuable because has that work done already, but the work wasn't necessarily reflective of the need. And so then people end up planting in other trees around when they need shade and they need screens from their neighbors and all these things, so.
And this is actually already a requirement inside the urban growth area, so we do have, we have information available about how this has been working in the county, and it hasn't been a barrier necessarily for landowners that have come in with forest conversion permits, and it really does address this speculative or prospective cutting of a site.
Have you got a development, I mean, a definition of what a development is versus a homeowner wants to build a house, build a barn, whatever? Have you divided those out between a development is, I don't know, 4 homes on 10 acres or whatever it might be versus 1 home on 5 acres? Is that a development as well? Because a lot of times people are stuck with this financial consideration that they have to work out, you know. Then a recession comes along or inflation comes along and puts a bind on everybody. So trying to force that to happen all at once is, it's a little different from a commercial development versus a person trying to build a house.
Not necessarily a requirement to have the house built,
Right.
it's just knowing where on that property you would want to build that house in the future, so that you're only clearing the trees, let's say, that would be necessary to accommodate that development. And the planning commission, along with the community, we definitely heard that single-family homes, like people should be able to build single-family homes, and enough space should be available to cut trees to accommodate single-family home development.
So that's one of the other changes, I think, in my next, what am I gonna do here? So, actually, it's number 6 on the list, Commissioner Edwards, just so you know. And then, so number 3 is to protect the trees that are really critical, and the ones that are very large and very valuable for ecosystem services, like water, stream, trying to not say stream flow attenuation.
Yeah.
So just the way our water flow works and making sure that we're capturing that water rather than letting it run off. Large trees do a better job of that. Large trees do a better job of our carbon capture. There's science to back up those pieces, so prioritizing that was a big priority. We also wanted to make sure that we weren't gonna have trees that were gonna be vulnerable to wind throw and things like that. So really kind of putting all those pieces together and making sure we made their critical or the appropriate space for any wildland urban interface codes that are kind of currently in the works, kind of looking ahead to those and how they might impact how people develop on their land, and making sure we have enough space that if wildfire comes, people have that defensible space to mitigate those that emergency. So another change is that we wanted to make sure it was flexible and provided the incentives to keep trees, but also recognizing if we're going to develop, then trees are gonna need to be cut, trees are gonna need to be cleared. And so keeping the retention requirements over the whole parcel was important to that. And we'll get into the details and the numbers, and I think it's just on the next slide, so I'll just keep it at that for now. But making sure that those numbers applied to the entire parcel rather than acre by acre, so that we weren't absolutely, I think I'll discuss it when we have the chart up, because it's a little bit easier.
And this is another area where tree replanting is already required inside of urban growth areas, but was not required outside of urban growth areas. So
Right.
it's one of those provisions that has been part of the code for a number of years and hasn't been an impediment to developers in the urban growth areas. And the Planning Commission really wanted to see that extended outside of the urban growth areas.
Right.
So on that topic, where you're treating all the land the same, inside and outside, is that really feasible? Because all the growth is supposedly gonna take place in the UGA versus in the outlying areas of rural America.
The replanting requirements were scaled to reflect what is already required inside the UGA, which I think was one of the concerns of the commissioners, the commissioners that voted nay was, well, let's go beyond that. Let's require even more, but, you know, in terms of this big shift, really using what has already been part of that, part of our code, part of Thurston County Code for years, and sort of building off of that, and extending it outside. So it has not been an impediment, as far as we know, in terms of conversion of these forest lands within the UGA.
And another piece is that, you know, people who are developing in the unincorporated areas don't just work in Thurston County, they work in our neighboring counties as well.
When you say developing, I guess I'm hung up on that, because are you talking about building a home or putting a big development in?
Both, and mostly for this case, it is single-family home builders.
It's anything where you're taking a tree down and it's not gonna be replanted. It's gonna be something that's not a tree. Any building is
How-
development, because that's conversion, that's forest land
How
conversion.
about somebody that's taking down some trees for their agricultural activity, which is gonna be raising hay? I don't know, I mean, just using that as an example. How does that fit? I mean, where you've got ag going on, pasture maybe for your dairy, I don't know what it might be, but, so you're gonna try to have complete control over those individuals that are gonna change their, cause raising trees is an ag activity. It's just a long-term ag activity. Now I wanna plant corn on that property so I can have a cash crop. Instead of waiting 40 years, I can have it every year. So how does that play in to this concept?
That's the exemption, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So agriculture actually is one of the exemptions, because we do have, we do have that happening, right? And we have, producers that are, you know, raising one thing one year and need to switch crops, and because of the diversification of agriculture and keeping it viable, it's really critical that they have that option. And we have this, you know, kind of uprising of silviculture or silvipasture, where folks are using the trees alongside their agricultural crops. And so there's a lot of different ways to manage that and to give people flexibility. We incorporated a exemption to the conversion permit requirement that would allow people to submit and be part of a forest, I think it's called a farmland conservation plan. So they submit a farmland conservation plan, and then, you know, they are able to, within that plan, dictate, okay, I need to take these trees out because this is gonna go in hops, and then it's gonna go into this crop and this crop, and they have a long-term plan for what that land is gonna be doing, because we recognize agriculture is valuable for a lot of the different things that, you know, we wanna see trees on the land, and agricultural crops are also valuable for those things as well.
So they wouldn't necessarily have to replant, like if they wanted to clear a forest to switch to a different product, they would be exempt from these replanting requirements.
Yeah.
As long as they submit a plan like documenting that they are actually gonna put it in agriculture, so that you don't have a loop, you're not creating a loophole where someone just checks the
Yes.
box and says, oh yeah, I'm gonna put it in agriculture. So we have tried to allow for flexibility while also get some assurances that it will be put to an agricultural use.
Right. Alright. So then, the moratorium releases is the last one I want to discuss. And that's the number 6, and it's really critical to understand because moratoriums really limit the development on a property. And so when,
And what are they tied to for the new
Yes.
commissioners?
yes,
Or all
great,
commissioners.
all the commissioners.
These are
So-
complicated.
Any of those state permits for forestry that are for commercial harvest, the class 2, class 3, class 4 special, those permits come with an automatic moratorium from the state. The state places the moratorium, And it is our discretion whether we release the moratorium and under what circumstances.
So you or the county, are you saying that the county will have the ability to release a state moratorium? So I think, I'm gonna say 7 years, for some reason
It's
it's
6.
six.
Yeah,
It's 6 years. Okay, so they put a restriction on for 6 years,
right.
and during that time you have to replant, I think, as well.
During that time, well, so it kind of depends. You have 3 years to replant on any of those permits. And you will not be released from the moratorium under our current standards unless you have replanted.
Yeah, but does the county have the authority to do away with the state moratorium?
We have the authority because we requested the authority. This is part of the whole package. So we requested the authority for the class 4 permits and the authority for the moratorium releases.
And so we currently have 3 pathways in the Thurston County Code to release a moratorium
From the state?
from the state. And what the Planning Commission, when they reviewed the 3 different pathways and looked at what other counties are doing, they really advocated to one pathway and limit it to single-family homes.
You know, I think in the past, the fact that you had to pay that, I don't know, 6 or 7 years back taxes, that was the issue that kept people from doing these things. And there didn't have to be any kind of I don't know, there wasn't an enforcement arm. You just couldn't get a permit to build a house or do what you wanted to do within that 7-year period. And I think that kind of kept things healthy without, I mean, they knew that was gonna be the case when they logged it. So I'm trying to think, are we doing away with some protections to grant maybe other protections that the reality is we won't be able to follow up on those and follow through and really do near as good as what it's kind of like volunteer stewardship to a degree. I mean, you know what you're up against initially, got 7 years, you can't do anything, or you're gonna pay this 7 years back taxes, which is substantial because it's based on the current tax assessment, I guess. Is what it is.
So this code doesn't talk about that assessment. That's all still in place. All those protections are still in place as well as these protections. So
Yes.
it's like
Mul-
two
mul-
different kinds of protections.
Yeah, multiple tools in the toolbox
Yes.
with conservation in mind. With tree conservation in mind.
Right.
So this isn't taking away a tool, it's sharpening a tool that the county has.
What does the county do if somebody just cuts all their trees down on the property?
It would be an enforcement action.
Enforcement.
Yeah, what does it mean?
The enforcement typically, well, the enforcement typically would be replanting, but you're right, that's not equal.
Yeah, so what happens?
I don't
Haven't got there
speak for
yet.
the compliance team,
Well, I can
but
give
we
an
could-
example.
I
If
know
we
this.
fought on that down near Tenino, I don't know if you know the people, I can't think of their name now, but they bought a piece of property that had been logged, completely stripped off. It wasn't supposed to be. And then they put a venue up and all that. It really caused a nightmare. And there was seemingly no enforcement that took place by the county because the law, the regulation was there, but wasn't anybody doing anything about it, because we have limited resources.
So what happens? I
do
mean,
our job.
I'm dead
Yeah.
serious. What
So
what
nothing,
happens? 'Cause why-
nothing happens.
You can't,
Yeah.
if you can't enforce something, what do you know?
You can be, so there's,
Yeah.
even if it's actually enforced and the fines are so pathetic that all developers, to my knowledge, just,
write a check.
well, they don't care. It's like, oh, I'd gladly pay that money right now to have the permission to cut the tree. So if like, you know, if it's gonna enhance the view, for example, this happens in Steamboat Island all the
It's a
time.
business cost.
They know that, yeah, it's a business cost, like first of all, they're never gonna get charged a fee because we don't do it, but even if we did, it would be a tiny drop in the bucket. It would be like going out to dinner on a Friday night for them to be able to enhance the value of the property by
Yeah.
triple or whatever, because now they gotta view a Mount Rainier or whatever. So I got into this my first year on the board, and I'm the one that pushed this whole thing because I was just appalled by what the state of our laws and code ordinances about this. There's no enforcement, there's no rules, there were inconsistent rules, staff didn't even understand what the rules were. I called the key staff, sorry, you guys weren't even here, so this is not on you, but I called staff in to just explain it to me, because I was trying to explain it to my constituents. Staff couldn't really even explain to me these rules. They're so complicated. And they're ineffective, and now we're trying to enforce a climate, mitigation plan. We've learned that of the tree, and climate, in terms of the jurisdictions, the climate impact does not care where development occurs and where the jurisdictional boundaries are. Trees are trees, and 93% of the canopy we're trying to protect is in the rural county. So it's on us. It's not on City of Olympia. They can pass the most restrictive tree ordinance on God's green earth. It's gonna do nothing. It's on our backs to save the tree canopy of this county and try to meet the climate goals and sequestration and to actually implement the climate mitigation plan. So this is like a first step. And I've gone through this with staff, and it really was hard for me to understand. Now I understand it, and I think it's all good. And it's a first step toward where we need to be looking to try to do this. And it is more flexible. You're gonna get to that, I know, on your next slide, but there's flexibility so that it's sensible, but there's at least some rules, because right now, there's nothing.
Yeah, there was a property outside of Tenino, 5 acres, absolutely treed, totally, completely clear cut and turned into a wrecking yard. No permits, no discussions with the county, no nothing, tons of complaints from the community in a residential area, and still, it's like 2 years later and
And you go to King County.
nothing's happened, but I would,
In Seattle and King County, that doesn't happen because there are substantial fines that can be imposed to where it's a disincentive
Well,
to violate the rules.
yeah, but the reality is, in those jurisdictions and even Pierce County, they have retail income, and so they have sales tax to fund their government. We have no sales tax to fund our government. Everything was bypassed going out Martin Way. The city of Lacey and Olympia took all the revenue and left us Tangle Wild and Thompson Place and different trailer parks and all the problems we dealt with. So we have no revenue. We had a case right over here on Kaiser Road that the county dealt with for 20 years, trying to get that mess, like what you're referring to, cleaned up. And finally, the prosecutor's office, they don't have time, they don't have the resources, but finally, they took them in and actually got title to the property. But it took 20 years to do that. So if we do something that's this, I'm gonna say this strict, I don't know that it's this strict, it sounds like there's some flexibility here, but we also have to have the other process in place, which we don't have in place, and we're not likely to have in place unless we have a revenue stream that's gonna fund it. And we have no growth going on in rural America to create retail outlet. And when I say, but outside of the municipal boundaries. And we need to rethink the whole program, I think. The whole UGA was supposed to be rethought a couple of years ago.
As it relates to this project, the other
The
recommendation
from the planning commission was exactly that, was
Yeah.
this problem. Because it is out of sight of the scope of what we were dealing with these codes and this update. I know, I see your eyes. How is it outside of the scope when it is the answer to this problem? Or it seems like the answer to this problem, or one of the solutions? However, because this is so complex and involves so many pieces coming together, we need to lay groundwork. I keep telling people this, but it's like, there's a hole in the bathtub, and we need to plug up the hole, and right now
Before
we
you
have
fill it up.
just a bit of cork.
Yeah, and they are different sections of Thurston County Code, so that's
Yes.
usually like our scope is, okay, we're gonna be looking at these sections. That's what we do our outreach around. And definitely fee structures, fine structures, those are outside the scope. But the planning commission did want the board to know that they shared similar concerns. And would like to see something placed on the appropriate department's work plans in the future.
Right.
So is this kind of like phase one, and then phase two is maybe kind of the enforcement and side?
So
Things.
this is phase one, absolutely, and we have 4 phases. Phase 2 is tree canopy assessment, and that is forthcoming. The data is here, we just need to package it in a report for y'all. And then 3 is looking at the UGAs and how this fits in with the UGAs and the joint plans. And then 4 is looking at how this fits in with the Title 18, which is zoning, and Title 20, or the zoning and other development.
I guess I have to say something, because Wayne brought up a good, that example of turning it into a junkyard or something. I can't name them off right now, but I could list them off since I've been here, dealing with at least 20 places, maybe 40 places of like 5 acres stripped off, junkyard, 7 motorhomes living on it, sewage on the ground. We can't get any of that handled through the county. I mean, it just happens and nobody does anything. So you ask, what's being done? Nothing is being done. The neighbors around it are aggravated all the time. They generally turn into meth, well, it used to be meth, now it's, I don't know, whatever else is out there common. And it's a nightmare. It's going on regularly. And so here we are trying to create a fix, but it's just gonna be one more thing that we don't have the resources to deal with if we don't fix the base problem, which we might not even need this if we were actually dealing with what is going on throughout the county right now. There's all kinds of those exact examples.
But I would disagree on trees, because trees isn't, there are areas where what you say is exactly right, because the laws, the rules are there and we can't enforce them. But here's an area where I think Dan is right. We need a groundwork. Like, we don't even have the right like system in place to be able to enforce anything, because it's a big mess.
It is a
This
mess.
is trying to clean up that
But this
foundation.
doesn't necessarily fix that mess, is my concern. It's just gonna be more regulation, and if somebody's not following the regulation, what do we do?
I think this process streamlines the regulation. It doesn't, from what I heard, there's these 2 different processes and it's just aligning everything so we have a good foundation. And from there is when we're gonna continue to add up. So it's just streamlining the regulations. It's not adding additional ones, it's just,
Well, and enforcing something that's unclear
Yeah.
is problematic. Enforcing something that's clear is less problematic.
It's still difficult.
Still difficult
Difficult because of due process, right?
Yes,
There is,
yeah,
it
which we're all okay with.
because of due process.
has to
Right.
unfold.
Before you jump to that though, I don't think we really understand moratoriums. the way-
Right, so moratoriums, that's okay. So moratoriums are placed on properties so that the landowner won't develop for 6 years because they are getting a permit to harvest trees and replant trees and harvest trees and replant trees. And that's the permit they subscribed to, or they applied for. They didn't apply for a conversion permit like we're talking about. So that's why the moratorium exists, because they're not supposed to develop, that's not what they signed up for. So the moratorium can be released by the county. Right now, we have 3 ways, and I think Ashley touched on that. But the 3 ways involve a waiver, which is a little bit of paperwork, the administrative review, which is a little bit of paperwork, and our permit staff review, and then the hearing examiner review. And they all have slightly different circumstances which lead to this and that. And they did favor single-family homes, so we kept that thread. And we saw that, we know in our county, and we've heard from constituents and residents that having housing affordability is a big issue. So we wanted to make sure that we retained that and safeguarded that as a exemption, or not exemption, but like a way to get out of the moratorium, but the only way. So only if you're building a single family home will you be able to have an administrative review of your moratorium and get released, and only after 3 years. So you have to wait the 3 years because you still have to replant. The replanting requirements are such that you can develop and replant on the same property
But
like
if you didn't get that permit to do the forest
Conversion.
plan, or
Right.
to do forestry for 6 years, you're not subject to that at all. You can still get a single family home
You have
And then you don't even have to talk to anybody if it's under 5,000 board feet.
Think about this though, if you've leveled 20 acres, you have to replant most of that, if you're doing a single family home, right? So you still have to replant 18 of those acres, I think, I have to double check
Yeah,
the number.
it's so,
But if you come in and you have a farm plan saying you want 18 acres to raise cattle and graze, and you don't want trees there, there's allowances for
Yes,
that too.
exactly,
yeah.
that's the exemption.
And this actually came from Pierce County, this sort of 3-year waiting period. 3 years is very intentional. It is, as you know, Commissioner Edwards, the time allotted to get all of your permit requirements satisfied for the state, because this is a state permit you're
State
getting a
permit.
release from. If for some reason the landowner met all those requirements, like is earlier than 3 years,
have
property
a
owner
release
could come
earlier.
in and still be eligible.
And the 3 years is actually meant to be flexible for the landowner because you might not necessarily want to harvest and then replant, given certain scenarios and seasonality of planting and species you're planting, all those kind of things. So the 3 years is meant to give you enough time to do it at the right time with the budget constraints and all the things. So it's meant to be generous, not punitive, in my understanding of how that works with
Will this
forestry.
disincentivize people from planting trees on their property? Like I could think, Gary's got 10 acres and he's like, I'm not gonna plant a tree on the property because then the county's gonna have, jurisdiction over me or.
We do have that 5,000 board feet threshold, right?
Okay.
5,000 board feet is about 2 truckloads of trees. So people can harvest that and do that with their forest at will without any permits or any questions. So
Every
if they wanna do
year
it
or 5,000 per year?
Yeah.
per year.
Okay,
Yeah.
It's intended for thinning, it's intended for being able to harvest a small
not the
amount.
lifetime of a property or
No,
like,
no.
okay.
And you told me, and just to, because you told this to me in my meeting with you, and you said it at the end, it was like, you were making this moratorium, like this was a huge loophole, and oh my God, but then you said there's only been like 8 of them or something in 16 years or something, or maybe
Over
I
the
did
last
backwards.
16 years, it's been moratoriums are about 8 per year.
8 per
Per
year,
year.
so,
Releases.
but it's a loop, but it's closing a loophole, cause if you go in and say, oh, I'm just gonna cut and replant, and then a year later, you're like, oh, I changed my mind, I'm gonna build a whole bunch of houses, like, but you got the permit under a different, so it's only somebody that,
Mechanism.
it's really creating flexibility for the person that honestly changes their mind, then they've got a way to deal with that. Or, as you say, if they're upfront about what they're doing from the beginning, they're going the conversion route, they don't have to deal with the moratorium. There was no moratorium, because they didn't promise to replant.
Yeah.
They said, I'm building something.
And
The other grace it offers is that we do have people coming in that just purchased property and they were not aware of the moratorium.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, it was not made clear to them in the sale process. So now they have just purchased a piece of land that they intended to build a house on because it had this nice big cleared area. And that's how it was marketed to them. Purchase the land, come into our permit office for a building permit to say, oh, you can't build for 6 years because you have a moratorium. They were never made aware of it. So this offers a grace for that situation, even though it's not necessarily our responsibility that they do have they can go back on a agreement in terms of that selling contract. We all know what it's like to buy and sell houses and how difficult that is, and going back on that can be very difficult, so.
Wayne, you mentioned there's a disincentive to planting trees. Well, even what we're doing right here, I was around years ago when they came out with this oak tree you needed to protect. When that was happening, I can't tell you how many oak trees were eliminated because of the discussion. And even this, when the threat and rumors get out there, you'd be surprised, people just cutting stuff down like you can't believe because they're afraid of government overreach, I guess, is the best way I can
But
put
there's
it.
already restrictions
Yeah,
in
but they don't
place.
do it, but nothing happens.
Yeah,
You can cut all the trees you want, nothing happens when you cut trees. The only thing that happens, I had a big tree, I asked the county to, if I could cut it, it was about that big. And they said no, and the wind changed direction and came along and put it right through my house.
yeah.
It's, it was about a $400,000 loss in the end. I mean, I had insurance that covered it for about, $280 or whatever it was, but, I mean, so I think good people get a bum deal.
That's
Yeah.
usually the case.
People that wanna take advantage of the system, they just take advantage of it. And nothing ever happens to them, ever. And that's what worries me about this as we put things in place. If it's not clear, there's confusion about what am I gonna be able to do, what am I not gonna be able to do.
But there's things in place now,
There-
and it's unenforceable because it's not clear.
It's not clear now, as Commissioner Menzer mentioned, it is not clear now. It is really difficult, and hopefully the new proposed codes will be clear.
And most of the things that are in place in the UGA and not over the larger county. Moratoriums are over the, in larger county. But again, with 3 pathways and not knowing which one you fit in, it gets murky. So, can we go on to tree protections? Is that okay?
Let's move on.
All right. So I want to talk about this because this is really the basis of how we're prioritizing and incentivizing keeping those larger trees and also having flexibility for any of those developments, single-family homes. So if we have 100 units per acre, the units can change depending on the class of tree. So if we say that's the minimum you need to have on your property as you develop, you have 5 acres, 100 units per acre, that's 500 units over your property. And it's at an average over the entire property, so you can clear a section, but then have more density in other areas. So then I wanted to skip down quick to the table. Seedlings are worth 1 unit per acre, or 1 unit. Okay, so if it's just a seedling we pop in the ground, so that means you need to replant at 100 seedlings per acre. So that is really contrasted with the DNR's replanting, which is 190 seedlings per acre. And that's because this is a development permit. This is not, as Commissioner Fournier pointed out, this is for cutting. This isn't the one for cutting and replanting and cutting and replanting and cutting and replanting. This isn't commercial. This is for development. So we wanted to make sure that wasn't the same standard. Also then, significant trees are those 4 inches to 24, and these are the numbers you were asking for, Commissioner Edwards. So significant trees are 4 inches to 24 inches. And that lines up with some of the standards we had in Public Works, where they were calling those significant trees already. And if they were in the right of way, then they had, they had to go through other permissions from their director to cut those trees. So that was already in place as well, but we're just applying that to larger parcels and also giving it a value. So it's 5, so 20 of those per acre. Then we have landmark trees.
And then clarification.
Yes.
When you're talking about size, you're talking about,
Oh, yes, diameter at breast height,
yeah, so
Yeah.
it's
Diameter or circumference?
diameter,
diameter.
yeah, DBH.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
it's,
Chest height
Yeah.
or the average
Well,
height
no,
given.
it's a forestry term.
Okay.
And it's at 4.5 feet off the ground. And if it's on a hill, there's a specific way in which one to measure from, and they've got it all. It's called DBH, and it's a standardized system of measure for trees.
just wanted to make sure we weren't thinking
Thank you.
40 inches tall.
Oh,
yeah.
thank you. Yes. I appreciate that. So yeah, this is all DBH. So landmark trees are 24 inches to 60 inches, or 40 inches. And then the heritage trees are 40 inches plus. And heritage also includes any trees that have been earmarked for special cultural protections, like culturally modified trees. And also any trees that have been designated, like the bush butternut tree would have fit in that category. We have a couple of other trees that might have fit in that category because they've been like noted as a historical resource, a cultural resource. So heritage is a little broader than just size. And then the significant trees, landmark trees, we have some trees like madrone, a couple different species, and it does detail that in code, that are mature and fit that landmark definition at a smaller diameter. And so we do have a few trees that have smaller diameter categories. I think the madrone was 10 inches. I can look it up in the code.
Pescara was over
Pescara,
8,
yes.
Madrone over 8, Pacific
Thank
View
you.
over 8, Lodgepole, Short
What
Pine over
about
12.
though, I'm picking out, like, I'm gonna talk about significant, the significant category
Mhm.
and the landmark category. There is a big difference between 4 inches and 24 inches. And there's a lot of years that have to pass by to make that difference. So is that really a fair metric to use as your scale versus a 4 inch is worth 5 points, a 5 inch is worth 8 points. I don't know, something besides that, because that's kind of crazy that way.
It's kind of broad.
Yeah.
Right, and some of these are some of the questions that we had from the planning commission and why we had, one of the reasons, not specifically this, but the retention requirement category, where we have specific retention requirements for the landmark trees and the heritage trees. So those categories, that's why we had two commissioners say they couldn't vote in favor of it, because they felt like it needed to be greater. And so one of the pieces that we really stuck to for this whole process was to keep it simple. And the more categories you have, the more complex it can get.
Well, yeah, I can understand that, but if you had an inch diameter exempting like madrone or something like that didn't fall within any of this. So you have deciduous and conifers and that type of thing. And they've got a pretty standard rate of growth that would be pretty easy to figure out that point schedule to be much fairer than that, because a 4 inch tree and a 22 inch tree get the same points. And there, if you think about the canopy that exposes shadow to the growing area, it prevents all these other trees from growing even. So I think that's a no-go for me, that you would even contemplate something that restrictive, I guess is the best way I can put it. Because it doesn't give any benefit for those that are saving some of the bigger trees, 10s and 15s and 20s and stuff.
So are you suggesting a greater gradation in the point schedule?
Yeah,
To
that's
reflect
what
that?
I would think would make it fairer for those that would select to save. Because those trees are more apt to withhold I don't know the carbon equation, but the bigger tree holds the more carbon until it gets to a certain size, then it starts losing. I guess.
And that's really why we went with the 24 to 40 inches, because typically that is the age and the size at which the carbon sequestration potential and the water management really kick in and are the very most valuable.
Well, yeah, but it would almost have to be something besides that. I don't have that all figured out in my head, but I mean, retention of a mature tree on water is the formula, I think, for that on a 24-inch tree, 250 gallons a day it puts into the atmosphere, draws out of the groundwater and puts into the atmosphere. And so there's things like that you can take into consideration. And boy, that is a disincentive, like the commissioner brought up, to cause a problem, in my estimation.
So isn't I'm looking at the retention requirement.
Right.
And for a tree smaller than 24 inches,
Mm-hmm.
it says there is no retention requirement.
There is no retention requirement other than the minimum tree density. So all of those can be selected or cut. So the only ones that have a retention restriction or requirement are the landmark trees.
Larger trees.
Yes, so they have to have at least 30% of those as part of your minimum tree density points.
So this seems to make it less restrictive,
Right.
not more restrictive.
It does, in that, depending on how you're selecting your trees and where you're putting them. Yeah, the 100
Seems to be
units per
strictly
acre
by size.
make sense, but not enough credit is given towards that 100 units if you had all 20-inch trees or 23-inch trees or whatever.
If you had all 23-inch trees and 99 of them, you could cut them all down.
And these categories were developed a couple different ways. The first I guess, draft of the categories was brought from Pierce County. And partially because we have such similar forests as they do, and we have similar development and similar pressures. And so these numbers are pretty directly what they had. I think they use a 0.25 and we wanted to use whole numbers instead of decimals, so we just slid the scale up to reflect that. Otherwise, the categories were the same as theirs, and then we had a few conversations also with the cities to talk about what their categories were, and in some cases, the cities have more categories, and so we tried to fit in their categories, but also tried to make sure that their categories fit within our categories so that people could work within the city and the county and have a general understanding. That one of the big points was to make sure the names were the same so that people understood what a significant tree is, what a landmark tree was, and those things. And Tumwater really has led the charge, and they had a consultant really work on their forest conversions, forest
they're
conversion.
urban
Urban
forestry.
forest, yes, urban forestry. It's not just their plan, though, it is their codes, yeah. So the urban forestry standards, and they too had similar standards in place. And so the 4-inch has a certain, is like the definition of not a seedling anymore tree, if that makes sense, so. And it's also very valuable to look at and make sure the public, that's something that we take to public hearing and get their feedback on.
Which takes us to the next slide, which
Next
is the
slide.
planning commission recommendations and then next steps.
Right, thank you. So we're hoping that I'd love to take your questions at this point. I know we've been kind of back and forth on this and you've been very engaged and asking things. So if there's any further questions, we'd love to ask them. And then we talked a little bit about what the planning commission recommended and the 2 recommendations they said. If you want more information on that, happy to provide it.
Commissioner Menzer, go ahead.
So at lunch, I was looking through my notes from our one-on-one session, and you got into something kind of complicated at the end of our meeting, something about you could cut certain number, critical area, 80%, 90%. Is that ringing a bell to you? Yes,
Yes.
is that worth getting into touching on, or is there a reason why you're not talking about that?
No, I mean,
No.
it's okay if I
Yeah.
sort of, and you'll have to forgive me. I worked on this before Dana joined the county, so that's why it's like I was in on all of the early conversations.
Yeah.
To dive into that, we need a little bit of structure around what the state permit regulates in terms of critical areas and what the county does. So the state permit does not recognize our local critical areas. So if you go in for a state forest cutting permit, they have some environmental protections. They aren't nearly as expansive as ours here locally. That is one of the reasons why the state permit, along with it being way more affordable, landowners might choose that or try to choose that path. There is a pathway, for lack of a better word, for counties or local jurisdictions to incentivize someone to come to us along with the state to essentially allow for a forest cutting on their site without a moratorium. So they could do that prospective cutting that they might want to do, but the clincher is they would have to recognize our local critical areas ordinance. And so provides flexibility for a landowner to cut a certain percentage of trees on their site and leave the door open for future development. And what we get out of it as a county is recognition and protection of our local critical areas through that process. Right now, the most someone could cut under this sort of flexible approach, sort of optional conversion, conversion option harvest plan is only up to 30% of the trees on the site.
Right now.
And what
In a
we
critical
heard from
area.
fellow counties is that that's just not enough. If you really wanna
doesn't
give someone
incentivize.
flexibility, you gotta allow more.
So no one's using is what you explained to
No
me.
one's
It's
using
like
it.
it's it's an incentive and, we're trying to be, protective, but it's not working, it doesn't do anything. And so there's a recommendation to increase that so that it might get used.
Right.
Because otherwise they can just cut in our critical areas and this is getting at least some of that protection back.
Cut in critical areas and then come back for a moratorium release.
Well, and if we thought maybe it was too restrictive to have someone come in with their development permit and their forest conversion permit at the same time, then this is the other option. This provides a pathway to cut trees in advance, not really having a development permit at the same time and maybe doing development later.
What happens if a person comes in, maybe they already have a house there, and they just, I hate trees, I don't want a single tree on my property, and they come in and they say, I'm gonna cut all my trees down. Is there what, you just say no, and then they go do it anyways, and then
The replanting requirements would
Replanting
apply.
requirements. So maybe they could replant shorter trees or deciduous trees.
By going to get a 2 and a 3 permit from DNR.
They would have to
They'd have
replant.
to replant.
But I know that requires replant.
Right, so our permit, right now, they could do the conversion option harvest plan. And then they would have no moratorium and they wouldn't have to develop. That is their pathway.
But they don't wanna develop, they just don't.
That's what I mean, they don't have to develop.
they just hate trees.
They just don't wanna.
Then they're in the wrong county, no,
No.
just,
I mean, is that the answer? I don't know.
no,
They need a
not
doctor's
necessarily,
permit?
no. I think it's
There's
just
a whole other side of the
pretty,
state where they can
Okay,
live in
okay,
peace with
okay.
no
No, they're
trees.
allergic to cedar pollen.
Maybe.
right, and.
The planning commission, was
In
pretty
favor
clear
of
about
retaining.
trying to tighten up tree cutting. And so allowing flexibility for tree cutting when you wanna build a single family home or when you wanna establish an agricultural operation,
Yeah.
but not necessarily because you just don't want any trees on your property.
I think that if I could speak into the thought there, is that especially the larger trees are enough of a benefit to neighboring properties that,
Yeah, I get it,
yeah.
but maybe there's 1% of the population just hates trees and,
I know someone who hates trees.
yeah.
But that's,
They
I
don't live
mean,
here.
the whole point is that's impacting all of us
Mhm.
at this point, so there has to be some, so in my notes, it says planning commission allows 90%, but says they dial it back to 80%, what does that mean?
So that was Pierce County.
PC, I
yeah.
said PC, okay, Pierce County.
Pierce County allows 90% of that, when you're using that conversion option harvest plan, they allow 90% to be cut. Because again, this is not people who necessarily want to develop, they're people that are mostly harvesting to replant, but maybe not sure if they're going to develop, maybe. It's a wishy-washy middle ground a little bit.
Is there any talk about mitigation, I don't, right? I don't. But let's
Sure.
say I do hate trees and I don't want any on my property and I'm willing to pay to have them planted somewhere else. Just like with gophers or just like with, destroying wetlands
I
or.
think that's actually referenced in the climate mitigation plan is one of the opportunities is for something like regional tree mitigation. Nothing like that
Tree
exists
banking.
today. But I know that there, at least in the carbon sequestration white paper, there are some references to that is a potential idea.
Is that something that's going to be added on in a later phase or?
That,
Consideration for the
Consider it
board.
for a later
Consideration for-
phase?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the intention is that this is the first step of a larger programmatic approach to the county managing forests and protecting trees, and that this is just one step, and that the board can decide what that program looks like.
So this conversion option harvest plan, this is something we have,
yes.
We have, but we
And-
only allow 30%.
but are we,
No one uses it.
is the proposal to change it to 80 or 90?
So it changes it to 80,
Okay, so
Yeah.
that's in here,
yes.
potentially, that we would take to public comment.
If you accept these changes as written, as proposed by the planning commission, as recommended by the planning commission, that's the word. If you accept these changes as recommended by the planning commission, then yes, that would change to 80%. And there are a couple of other minor pieces of that. Since the conversion option harvest plan has also a look by a DNR forester and they have the secondary permit process, so that permit comes to our eyes for critical areas, and it goes to DNR for forestry. So we wrote the standards in a way that it could be, the plan could be completed by a landowner, not necessarily have to have a forester review and write that plan.
That's nice.
How long of a period of time would elapse between somebody making application and getting authorization? And where I'm going with this, I think the state has some new requirement starting in 24 that when somebody applies for something at the planning department, they got 30 days or something to.
I think Brett,
That's a different-
yeah, I think Brett is
yeah.
working on that.
That's-
So,
yeah.
do we have something in place that is simple, that's gonna match that? I don't know what the time frame is, I can't remember what it is, but there's a new time frame starting in January, I've heard, that we have to get permits out by.
Not January, January of 2025.
Is that what it is? Okay,
Yeah.
January 2025. So we have a certain amount of time to respond to that public request. Do you have some mechanism in place so they know, okay, they can put in here, you know, it's wet time of the year, whatever, we're gonna do a little logging and we can't drive on it for another 2 months. So how much time do they need to put in to be able to get authorization from the government back? Is
Well,
there a
right now,
mechanism in
that's a-
place?
Yeah,
That permit.
yeah,
department question.
the permits exist today, so it wouldn't be a change. If you wanted specific information on the average time it takes today, we could bring you that.
No, I don't know if I need that. I'm just trying to think of a way. Can we get around? I put in for something here 3 years ago and I finally got it. Okay, just, it's the way it goes. I mean, sometimes, so.
In this case, it's not any new permits. The
No.
permits exist today. It's just what those application requirements are.
And if anything, cleaning them up and making them more clear
That helps, yeah.
should help that.
This is only residential. This is not
No.
industrial, commercial. Those will have a different.
We don't see many of those, but it was really, the planning commission
Scope was
limited
limited
it to single-family residential for the moratorium releases. If an industrial, multifamily, commercial development came in, they would be able to come in for a forest conversion permit.
Yeah.
The replanting, though, does not apply, since there
The
are,
minimum tree density standards in general don't apply to the commercial developments or industrial developments because they already have standards covered in Title 20.
Okay.
Yeah, and they already require certain tree, open space, tree tracks, all these kind of things.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so next steps?
Next up, so we would like to know if you feel comfortable setting a public hearing and hearing what the public has to say. And then we'll schedule a follow-up briefing.
oh, yeah, or schedule. a
Oh, sorry, yeah, or schedule a follow-up briefing. I thought after the public hearing, we probably would have another follow-up as well.
Probably, yeah.
Right, or we can follow this with another briefing to answer more questions or bring you more different information.
Okay, so how are commissioners feeling? Do they need more information or are we ready to move forward with a public hearing in January?
I just don't think that we're there yet myself, but that's me.
What additional information do you need?
Well, I wanna see what is actually going to be affecting the citizenry that we're trying to regulate. I need to see a little more of that. Sounds like Wayne's got a pretty good idea. This applies only to single-family residents, which is,
Different pieces, so depending on which piece, whether it's the moratorium release, there's a lot of different components to this chapter. The replanting, that minimum tree density would just be to
Single family.
single-family residential.
okay, I mean, and we can make other adjustments, I guess, on, like that point system, I guess that can be, we can change that at any time before we enact it, if that was an issue, I guess.
And we wouldn't be requiring existing plots of land to come into compliance with minimum tree densities.
No. No.
It's always prospective.
Yep, I wanted to say that.
It was very helpful to me to sit down with Devin and Ashley, and if we set a public hearing in January, then you've got plenty of time between now and then to do that if you want more. That's be my suggestion. Set the public hearing and then follow up as needed. Cause it was pretty complicated. We tried to run through this in half an hour and the first time, and
The first time, and it was.
I didn't even, I walked out not even understanding anything, frankly, cause it was like, we didn't get to the meat, you know, the meat is like, what are these, how does this tree protection system work, and what are the moratoriums about? You were talking about the process and the planning commission and all of that.
We got stuck with the DNR moratorium. I think that's where
Yeah,
we
and
kind
I
of
didn't
got.
understand.
Yeah.
I'll chalk that up to
moratorium.
my lack of understanding how much time we needed to go through it and
Yeah, no,
first
it's-
time through.
You did a great job explaining it, we just needed more time.
How much, oftentimes we'll set a hearing and notify people. There's no notifying folks on this because it applies to everybody, I think, right?
Well, we have countywide notification via the website, right? So everyone can go on our website at any time and see when all the public hearings are. And then we also, just have to use those channels because you're right, we wouldn't necessarily target just forested landowners or anything like that. That would not necessarily, that would exclude people who may become forest landowners in the future and that kind of thing.
There is a robust stakeholder list of all of the folks that Dana has.
And will they be
working with.
notified about it,
yeah.
besides just the announcement in the paper or?
Oh, they get a targeted email.
Yeah. And then we have our broader, we have thousands of subscribers to our webmail list and they get notification of all the public hearings, so.
I'm kind of right there to set a public hearing as well. I think hearing from the people who will be affected and then having a follow-up briefing on the discussion is going to be, that way we actually hear from the people who are gonna be
Sure.
affected and
To act,
we don't,
just because we have a public hearing.
I think we'll need a follow-up session after that to kind of have that discussion. But I feel like we'll be spinning our wheels because we don't know that aspect of the community input if, so I'm there as well to set a public hearing in January.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think it'd be a real interesting public hearing.
Okay.
If it goes haywire, we'll just say what Wayne said.
Yeah, always.
I'm kind of referring back to last night, that turned out pretty rambunctious, from, this isn't, nobody's complaining, we're not gonna hear anything about this
Yeah,
from Matt. So it can take a turn.
you never know, yeah.
Thank you, commissioners.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, it is 2:20. We are adjourned.